we are very much leaders. I mean, with all the providers and then sitting together and then creating momentum towards sustainability can actually, help a lot. And I think the strategy is probably a winning strategy here.
Timo, please, what is your perspective? Okay, I will ask Timo later. I have one more question on the impact or the potential of self-regulation. Jan, when you're already here in the screen. So, well, UNPRI has been at the forefront. This initiative, this largest initiative of investors supporting and developing responsible investing. But okay, so what is the impact of this initiative? And there I would like to address you concrete questions. So did the clients put pressure on you? Did they check which reporting you have disclosed? Could this participation in UNPRI improve your performance?
Well, there are many aspects with the UNPRI, and I think the UNPRI deserve a lot of praise for that initiative. At the beginning, it was certainly kind of a, let's say, also a greenwashing exercise because everybody could sign in and nothing really happened. But at some point, the reports became mandatory, and even I hope you don't hear this the sounds anyway. So the reporting became mandatory, and clients are asking that at every RFP. So it is truly an important initiative. But the PRI is only one starting point. So we have now the principles for responsible banking as well, and we signed up to that. And that goes even further, that we have to pledge allegiance to the Paris Agreement, and on top of that, allegiance with the Sustainable Development Goals, and say what our impact is on that side. And there are many other initiatives which are, of course, veering towards that. And then now, of course, TCFD has become mandatory for PRI members, which is another big step and another step helping, orientation towards sustainability. And now in Switzerland, it becomes mandatory for the big banks to issue TCFD reports, and even for the bigger companies from the federal authorities. So I think that there is a big movement towards that. And this sort of initiative, I think it has helped the sustainability cause a lot.
And if you go through this, so do you even see that asset manager are actively supporting to strengthen regulation, as this might also support their pioneering status?
Well, yes, to some extent, what you can see is that as more and more banks, opt towards, really not issuing niche products in sustainability, but really putting the whole range towards sustainability, that they become more and more forceful also in the regulatory process, and more open to do such self-regulations and to do initiatives, because they are reporting anyway, right? If you are PRI member, you have to file your TCFD report anyway, so why would you oppose it? And this has created such a momentum, I think, that now the majority of the banking sector is actually, in favor of sustainable investments, which can be shown in the Swiss, the recent referendum we had on the climate law, right, where it seems that the population was less prepared than the banking sector or the financial sector for the CO2 law.
Thank you. I would like to ask Timo to comment on this, because I'm afraid that he dropped out of the call. Or Timo, can you hear us? Hopefully he will join us later again. But I would like to pick up the current discussion on greenwashing. because, well, standardization is and transparency is one of the core elements of the EU action plan, and the current discussion shows that it is definitely needed. But okay, the question again is, how is it achieved in the best way? Und ich würde gerne die Runde mit Herrn Pitte nochmal beginnen. Hier einige Angaben, die ich gefunden habe. In der jüngsten Nachhaltigkeitsumfrage vom Schweizerischen Versicherungsverband berichten Sie, dass bei 83% der Anlagen Nachhaltigkeitskriterien berücksichtigt werden. Von 38 untersuchten Institutionen beziehen 32 ESG-Kriterien in ihre Anlageentscheidungen ein. Also definitiv noch mal weit über den 50% jetzt im Schweizer Fondsmarkt. Haben Sie allerdings dann auch Informationen über die Qualität oder das Anspruchsniveau der zugrunde liegenden ESG-Bewertungen? Was wissen Sie hier?
Ja, wir machen es so, ich betreue effektiv eine interne Arbeitsgruppe, die sich Responsible Investment nennt beim Schweizerischen Versicherungsverband. Wir haben in dieser Arbeitsgruppe diverse Vertreter von kleinen Versicherungsgesellschaften über mittlere und größere Versicherungsgesellschaften, und entsprechend haben wir den Fragebogen aufgebaut, wo wir die verschiedenen Capital Assets, die verschiedenen Kriterien etc. definiert haben. Wir haben das natürlich aber nicht rein aus SVV-Logik beziehungsweise neue Definitionen oder Standards etc. angewandt, sondern haben uns hier stark beispielsweise, wie es das SSF, also Swiss Sustainable Finance, definiert in ihrem Fragebogen, oder auch von anderen Institutionen haben wir uns daran orientiert. Wichtig war es oder ist es, dass wir natürlich unsere Fragebogen oder unsere Fragen natürlich gemeinsam diskutieren, dass wir auch gemeinsames Verständnis haben. Und es ist auch klar, wenn man gewisse Zahlen würde nachschauen gehen, beispielsweise von einer Swiss Re, von einer Zürich Insurance Group oder Swiss Life etc., wenn man hier die Daten vergleichen würde, würde man auch die gleichen Daten in Reports sehen, wo sie bereits heute öffentlich und transparent deklarieren, weil wir haben hier kein Interesse, unterschiedliche Definitionen zu haben, dass man auch sagen könnte oder vorwerfen könnte, das ist Greenwashing, sondern wir gehen eher den vorsichtigeren Weg und sagen, diese Zahl haben wir so aufgebaut oder so definiert, dass es effektiv verschiedenen Standards auch der Qualität genügt, dass man auch glaubwürdig auftreten kann und diese Zahlen so publizieren kann.
Merci. Vielleicht auch zum Thema Standardisierung würde ich gerne auf eine Initiative jetzt eingehen, dass das SIF im Frühjahr eine Konsultation zu regulatorischen Anforderungen im Kontext Sustainable Investing durchgeführt hat. Und dort ging es sehr stark auch um das Thema Standardisierung. Wir haben auch vom FNG hierzu eine Stellungnahme abgegeben. Hier vielleicht gerne Ihre Erwartung. Was denken Sie, was hier als Ergebnis herauskommen kann, beziehungsweise welche Lösung würden Sie denn begrüßen?
Ja, grundsätzlich, dass hier gewisse Standardisierung kommen, gegen diese verschließen wir uns selbstverständlich nicht. Wichtig ist einfach, dass wir den bisherigen Ansatz von unserem Finanzmarktregulator auch weiterziehen können, beziehungsweise dass wir nach wie vor prinzipienbasierten Ausgang, also Regulierung hier auch weiterziehen würde. Idealerweise werden halt globale und effiziente und pragmatische Standards, wie sie heute bereits bestehen, mit Blick auf TCFD etc. übernommen. Die Frage ist dann halt auch immer, dass das SIF, oder was hat sie effektiv für eine Zielsetzung dieser gewünschten Offenlegung? Das war bei uns teilweise nicht so klar, was sie dort beabsichtigen. Aber wichtig ist natürlich auch mit Blick auf die Schweiz, also dass wir hier nicht ein Swiss-Finish in den Standards oder was auch immer machen würden, oder? Weil es ist dann natürlich auch wichtig, dass unsere Exportfähigkeit und insbesondere auch die Wettbewerbsfähigkeit des Schweizer Finanzplatzes oder der Schweizer Finanzindustrie weiterhin mindestens gewahrt, also sogar noch verbessert werden kann.
Aber würden Sie es begrüßen, wenn SFDR auch für Schweizer Fonds jetzt verbindlich wird?
Ja, es ist durchaus eine Überlegung wert. Die Frage ist, wie es dann der Schweizer Regulator effektiv umsetzen will, wer alles betroffen ist und was natürlich die effektiven Anforderungen sind diesbezüglich. Ja.
Gut. Victor, so coming back to the general question, what do you think, how can regulation prohibit or better prohibit green or impact washing?
That's a very broad question.
You can start in a general. You have already commented on SFDR, so I leave it up to you to come from the general to the more precise point.
No, I think we first have the rules itself. We discussed already SFDR, what works and what probably works less well at this stage, and what needs to be probably in the future further improved. I think what's important afterwards is the fact that you are seeing in the system a pretty big role for regulators to enforce the rules. That's the idea at the end of the day. And there, I would say that my experience from a Eurosif perspective, dealing with different regulatory bodies across Europe and in different countries, there is some heterogeneity amongst regulators about a strong level of understanding of sustainability issues. I think we have to face the fact that there is there are different levels of knowledge amongst different regulators, and clearly the knowledge level of sustainability issues will need to go up significantly in the future if we want also a proper policing of those rules. I think what's a common thread around the implementation of SFDR is that for many regulators, they're in the same situation as the industry. They're learning on the spot, dealing with the new rules, and we see a lot of questions they have themselves. So I think that's the first thing we need to bear in mind. Is it's as new for some industry participants who have maybe not done sustainable investment for such a long time in the past, as well as for the regulators. So I think that's the key thing. Is we shouldn't only look at the rules, but we should also look at the resources and capabilities of regulators to do a serious job on combating greenwashing. I think that's a very important dimension to bear in mind.
Victor, but if I may chip in, but I think that's also the general rule in the European Union, that you have there is an EU law coming, and then you have suddenly those leader states, who are implementing that, and then the others are kind of following, right? And those maybe
absolutely.
Less knowledge. And that's also the right. But I think what is much worse, and that is a frightening development, I think to some extent, that the interpretation or the implementation of the EU laws differs in some countries. So effectively, the Doctrine AMF in France is basically prohibiting an entry into France if you don't follow their rules. And then now the German Verbände concept, which is coming up, is another thing which is sort of creating a gold plating. And if you want to comply to both standards, you get problems. So actually, and this is certainly a completely unwanted development within Europe, because you want to have free markets and open markets, but actually effectively what the European Union is creating is a mess of national standards, sometimes also self-regulatory standards, like the Austrian Umweltzeichen, which is very widely accepted by investors, but which creates sort of a closed shop. And this is certainly something, which shouldn't be tolerated, but it obviously is.
But I think I don't disagree with anything you just said. I think we at Eurosif already told nearly in January of this year, for the first time, we told the European Commission this was going to happen if you don't take control of the interpretation of the rules of SFDR. And they took their time to do that. And in the meantime, local regulators, understandably, because they want to protect their investors, their consumers, their retail investors in their market, are jumping in that gap. And as you say, adopting their doctrine, sometimes conflicting, sometimes not aligned. There's also guidelines in Spain, for example. They say something different again. So this patchwork is emerging, rightly because, as I said in my opening remarks, rightly because we are starting to realize that the SFDR has some bits that are okay, but some other bits are not fit for purpose.
And something that I also wonder, so Victor, as the EU plans to involve the local financial authorities like the BaFin in Germany to implement the SFDR, so how can this work that there won't be different standards according to each of the different financial authorities?
Well, that's very hard. The metaphor is, how do you put the genie back in the bottle once it's out? And that's the thing. Unless there is a broad consensus to find an answer to those issues at European level, I'm afraid we may see yet a few other regulators adopting local rules, and I think that's a very unwelcome development. But that's the nature of things in the EU. Because there's always a debate between do you want to do supervision at European level or at national level? So that's a completely other discussion and other discussion in the EU, which I don't want to start here because we could spend hours on that. But that's the complexity that we're facing.
Well, thanks. You're back. Do you want to comment on this discussion?
Ja, vielleicht gerne hier in diesem Punkt, oder das ist ein bisschen halt auch die Herausforderung aus Sicht der Schweiz, oder wir sehen das natürlich auch, wir haben hier auch von unseren Mitgliedern gehört, dass teilweise die Auslegeordnung des Regulators von Frankreich ganz anders sei als in anderen Ländern, teilweise strikter und andere Definitionen etc. Und hier, das ist auch ein bisschen auch der Hintergrund, warum wir hier nicht sagen, ja, wir finden es toll, wir sollten direkt sämtliche Regulierungen übernehmen, sondern wir möchten halt auch in einer gewissen Position sein, zum sehen, was sind ein bisschen die Lehren, wie setzen sie es um in der EU, was gibt es für Probleme, wie könnten wir diese natürlich in der Schweiz möglicherweise besser machen und vor allem eben die Erfahrungen reinbringen, weil es kann halt nicht sein, wenn man zwar einen gemeinsamen Standard hat, aber in den verschiedenen Ländern dann anders interpretiert wird. Weil es gibt schon halt Gesellschaften, die in mehreren Ländern Tochtergesellschaften haben oder Liegenschaften haben und die sind effektiv teilweise bereits heute, stehen sie momentan noch vor größeren Herausforderungen, wie sie das umsetzen und wie sie den verschiedenen Ansprüchen der Regulatoren gerecht werden.
So, thanks. And I want to come closer to one aspect is the kind of independent quality insurance and the labels that Jan already mentioned. And Timo, so your institute is involved in the FNG label as an auditor. But what do you think about the future of these labels? Are they still relevant next year when the precise requirements of SFDR will become live? And which other ways do you see to prohibit greenwashing?
First of all, sorry, I had to change my computer. No clue what was going on with the other one, but I'm back here. I think the role of independent labels in general, like the FNG, it is becoming increasingly more important. And I strongly believe we will see much more need for such labels in future. And again, just by listening to what Victor said earlier, the SFRD, the main purpose is not a product classification. It is to increase transparency. And based on this understanding, it is clear that we need something else because, frankly speaking, we as experts, we are struggling following the EU regulations on all these different levels and how they are interlinked and what it means and how to interpret them. And now just think about a typical retail investor who simply doesn't have the time to spend, with all the details and in order to understand what's going on. What she needs is some sort of easy to handle, easy to understand scheme classification, where he then or she can then decide, okay, I trust that, and I follow these advice, I follow these standards. Yeah. So therefore, I think all these EU efforts, I mean, they will definitely increase transparency, but they will not provide the answer that we need for retail investors when we talk about sustainable finance products. And therefore, yes, I strongly believe we will see this very powerful market segment using labels for classification purposes. And when we are talking about that, I believe what really matters here, and this goes back to the discussion we had earlier about industry self-regulation. What we know from the academic literature now, speaking as an academic here, and looking at other industry sectors, is industry self-regulation has its limitations. It works to a certain extent, but then it's not that effective like other ways could be. So that's one thing we know from the literature. And the other thing that we know from other industries is if there are some sort of industry self-regulation standards, the trustworthiness of these standards is enhanced once you integrate, like let's say, for instance, stakeholders, or you have an independent authority contributing to the reliability of that. And I think this also applies for a label or a specific standards in the sustainable finance context. It's really essential, if we go that avenue further, that we have some sort of an independent audit, or at least somebody stakeholders being involved in the process, what is important here, how to do it, and to actually check the reliability of the numbers.
Thank you. And as Jan, your bank applied both for the Austrian label and the FNG-Siegel, so can you tell us a bit more, which effect did this have, the process of applying to the label, both internally or externally for your distribution?
Yeah, so first of all, I certainly agree with Timo, what he said. If once you have a framework like SFDR, it just means self-classification. So it doesn't really, label your products. So there's no quality assurance if you have an SFDR 8 or 9 or whatever fund, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and if you mainstream sustainable finance, it means you need some assurance, some more transparency on the market. And this is why certainly, these labels are now really boosted in their standing and are very important to come in. From history, I mean, the Swiss banks have been more and more, or more or less, opposed to the labeling, because we have done our job already very early. We said, well, and particularly Jason Fraserazin has said, well, we are the standard. Why do we need a label? But of course, I mean, at some point, if you have this mainstreaming, it is good to have transparency, and therefore we also applied for the label. So what is the effect? I think, for our internal processes, the effect was not that strong, because I think we were up to speed with the FNG label. We got 3 stars for our flagship funds, so that's fine with us. But certainly, it is being demanded more and more by the market. It's becoming more and more a hygiene factor, even by the market. So you get all these questionnaires, these RFPs saying, okay, which labels have you applied for, and what have you achieved? And I think that's a clear tendency we see in the market. Again, coming back to the point I made earlier, it is very important that we don't start to segment all of Europe into separate niches. I see the comment by Roland, which is pertinent here in the chat, where he says all the Austrian Umweltzeichen is not a state label, but it is basically, you know, once it becomes adopted by all the Vorsorgekassen in Austria, and you know, the kind of the gold standard of them, it means it segments the Austrian market from all the other European markets. So we need to find a way where we may, you know, find some sort of harmonization. And I must say the FNG siegel, I mean, as opposed to the Label ISR in France, which is a one size fits all solution, right? Where you say, okay, either you achieve it or not. And once you achieve it, right, the extra effort you do doesn't help in the promotion of your fund, while the FNG siegel has you know, a basis and then the 3 stars, which of course differentiates the funds, which makes much more sense in terms of also in terms of you know, competition and development of offering in the market. So we hope that, I mean, we'll move to some sort of pan-European standard, maybe based on the FNG siegel, but let's see. That's it might still be a very long way out.
We have another interesting question from the audience, and this one is for Victor. And the question is, especially French asset managers declare a lot of their products to Article 8 and 9, partly up to 80% of all their products, whereas in other countries like Germany, we have quotas of around 20 to 30%. Is there any explanation, or do you have any explanation for this, Victor, or maybe the other panelists as well?
I have many explanations, but I can't particularly comment on a specific market or specific firm. But I mean, we've all seen the numbers. But I think, you know, we also see different behavior, for example, by non-European firms that have again a different tendency in terms of declaring their products. But I think that shows exactly the issue with the problem, which is that a lot of the SFDR at the end of the day is in some way it's self-regulation, because it's up to the firm to make an assessment about which investment strategy fits. Is it in Article 6? Is it in 8? Is it in 9? And you've seen, you know, you've seen I've seen marketing by firms saying I've been awarded an Article 9 status, and actually, well, you know, that's, you've awarded it to yourself. You interpreted the legislation and you said your strategy you think fits what is expected by the legislation from an Article 9 product. And I think that's exactly the heart of the problem, of the matter, which is there's a lot of room for interpretation, sometimes, you know, with no bad intentions. But I can recommend people to have a look, for example, at the quite good report written by Morningstar in July of this year, where you look actually really granularly in what kind of actual securities sits in the portfolio of an Article 9 product. You may be surprised by some of the results, and also surprised that maybe some securities are not very different from what sits in Article 8 or in the mainstream, you know, fund as well. And equally, you know, we had in the report clarity on the fact that there's some Article 9 products with 0% exposure to fossil fuel stocks, and others with 5 to 10%. So, and that shows that, you know, without a sign of bad faith, it shows that there's just different interpretation has been given to the same rules. And I think that's the situation, and that's where I think we can relate back to those discrepancies that we see in the market between countries, between firms.
I mean, just to add on to that, I think the answer to the question in the chat is, I mean, certainly Switzerland has always been, you know, a leading place for sustainable finance. But if you look at the European Union nowadays, the leading places in Europe is more France and the Netherlands, and to some extent also the Nordics. But France and Netherlands, if you don't, you know, label your products ESG, then you won't sell them. And this is, of course, and this is, you know, also due to the leadership of the French regulations, to be honest, of the Article 173. where you needed to show the climate credentials of your funds. And now they've introduced the biodiversity part, so they keep on this leadership in France, to be honest. And this is why you see many funds there being labeled 8 and 9. So it's not greenwashing or different interpretation. It is actually a real thing, and you can't get anywhere in those countries without ESG.
But exploring the opportunities to create transparency, so there are other ways, and I'm sure, Jan, you followed in Germany the discussion about the Nachhaltigkeitsampel. Is there anything you can bring into the discussion if this might be interesting here for Switzerland?
Well, another Ampel, whatever. We're talking a lot about Ampels these days in Germany. No, but I think, I think we have a solid FNG label. But of course, transparency is always a great thing. Of course, here in Switzerland, we've also discussed with together in the framework of Swiss sustainable finance, whether we wanted to, have a separate, gold plating Swiss label. I think we're still in discussions, but really, the question again is: does it make sense, or shouldn't we just say, look, there are these labels, there are the EU regulations. We have to adhere to them anyway, and that should be just fine. So we would not opt for a Swiss gold plating here.
Okay, coming back to the question if Switzerland will have a special role, hätte ich noch eine Frage jetzt zur Regulierung, auch in Bezug auf die Beratung an Herrn Pitti. Und die Frage ist wirklich jetzt auch gerade für Ihre Mitglieder, ob es Sinn macht, für die Schweizer Finanzakteure ihre Schweizer oder die EU-Kunden anders zu behandeln und im Kundengespräch zu befragen, wenn MiFID irgendwann implementiert wird? Oder gehen Sie eher davon aus, dass FIDLEG irgendwann ähnliche Vorgaben für die Abfrage von Nachhaltigkeitspräferenzen einführen wird?
Ja gut, das könnte durchaus sinnvoll sein, wobei eben in der Schweiz ist natürlich bei uns das Versicherungsaufsichtsgesetz, das das Ganze reguliert, also das sogenannte VAG. Ich kann mir vorstellen, eben, dass das früher oder später auch zur Diskussion wird. Wir wollen natürlich unsere Kundinnen und Kunden aus dem Ausland versus denjenigen in der Schweiz natürlich auch nicht bevorzugen, anders behandeln etc. Grundsätzlich stellt sich aber schon die Frage, was möchte man genau fragen, was ist das Ziel dahinter, und was man auch als Erfahrungen machen konnte, ist, hat der Wissensstand auch der Kundinnen und Kunden. Oder die Frage ist immer, auf welcher Flughöhe bewegen wir uns, und die Frage ist, wäre es vielleicht heute, zum heutigen Zeitpunkt, nicht allenfalls auch sinnvoller sein, dass man als Einstiegsfrage fragen würde, ob es grundsätzlich Interesse überhaupt gibt, in nachhaltige Produkte oder nachhaltige Anlagestrategien zu investieren, zu implementieren etc., anstatt dann einen ganzen Fragebogen mit diversen Fragen und Angaben durchzugehen, dass man dann diese Fragen durchgegangen ist und allenfalls auch, ich sage jetzt mal, die Kundinnen und Kunden damit auch bis einem gewissen Punkt überfordern würde, weil wir natürlich im Bereich, insbesondere im Bereich der anteilsgebundenen Lebensversicherungen tätig sind mit Investitionen, mit Anlagestrategien etc. Und hier ist ein bisschen schon die Frage, wie tief sollen wir jetzt mit Blick auf diesen Punkt oder auf diese Produkte hin bereits einen ganzen Fragekatalog haben, oder wollen wir eher auch schauen, besteht überhaupt das Interesse, ja oder nein?
Jan, may I ask you, how do you implement this question now in your private banking? Do you treat Swiss and EU clients differently? Or do you plan to treat them differently?
Well, they are still treated differently, although I think there's more and more of an alignment, and that's a beautiful example again of a self-regulation initiative, which we have in the Sustainable Finance Expert Commission of the Swiss Banking Association, where we have issued actually a guidance, a Leitfaden, to say how ESG should be integrated into the advisory process, which is again a bit looser than what we see in the European Union from MiFID, but it is certainly something which gives leeway, but which clearly gives direction to all the players in the market. Now, I'm a bit worried about MiFID, and it might be that we are overshooting the target, or maybe even shooting in our own feet if we have that type of MiFID that is maybe being discussed with asking a lot of questions about the principal adverse impacts, or whether a fund is playing these impacts or playing decarbonization path, or even the more granular it becomes, probably the less you can sell the less basically the client can actually buy, and also you have a problem that you lose more and more clients the more questions you ask, right? You get a decision fatigue, it's called, and especially online, in online surveys. There is a study which says that, every additional question you put, you lose 50% of your audience, which I think is not what these regulations intended. I think what we need to get to is basically say, okay, what do you expect from sustainability? And there are different things that sustainability is doing, right? One part may be just a bit of ethical alignment with a few exclusions. Okay, that is the lowest segment if you want. Then the second is about risk and return expectations, right? Integrating ESG for enhancing returns, reducing risks. That is the second category. And then you have something which is furthering sustainable development and creating impact. So all those people out there asking, what has ESG investing achieved? Obviously nothing, because it was just about risk return considerations for the funds. But if you search for impact investing, well, that is what this other label is. So I think we need to get, in order to counter these attacks against or about greenwashing, we need to get to a product clarity and an easy to understand classification of products, and ask the client about that, and that's it. Right, that's my opinion. Yeah.
So, have you already been able to implement this?
Well, to some extent, yes, because this is also how our product range is structured, and we don't, ask additional questions. Oh, do you want E? And if E, do you want windmills, or do you want solar panels? No, come on.
But for the advisory process, is it already in place for your clients?
But some things are in place and some things are not. Okay,
so let's hope. And coming back to the question of impact, and
if I can just jump on the point by Jan, I think that's a very valid point, because I think looking at what's been proposed under MiFID II in terms of identifying the sustainability preferences of clients, my sense is it's going to be very, very complicated to implement properly, because if you look at the different categories proposed, I don't know how most advisors are going to be able to explain to retail clients the share of taxonomy aligned investments and how that compares. It's going to be awfully complicated to explain, I think. In theory, yes. In practice, I think to Jan's point is, the more complex you make it, the more you lose people in the story. I think that's one. The second category of sustainable investments, we know, as we've just discussed before, that there are fundamentally different interpretations in the market about that same definition, and so you might be comparing apples and pears, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that works. And finally, on the taking into account principal adverse impact, it's a very nice notion, but I think it's still very vague, and everyone's trying to understand what are you actually doing from a sustainability perspective, and how much are you expected to do in that category. So I think we get reports from many of our members in different markets across Europe, actually, that it's not only a question about does the investor understand, but we may see actually that at a systemic level, there's quite a bit of a knowledge gap with many advisors as well.
Yeah, Victor, I have a bit of a different opinion about these principal adverse impacts. I think they are, I mean, it's actually good that we have them, because basically what you can do now is classify your article, your fund as Article 8, and say, well, look, I have my own ESG approach, and you show it, and maybe it has 99% G and almost nothing in ES. But the principal adverse impact measurements, right? They force you to basically disclose also, what the CO2 emissions were, what the waste ratio was, what the wastewater use was. So the classical ESG factors that we are integrating anyway in our funds. So I think it preserves to some extent a little bit of reasoning or of transparency, and makes sure the people have to report these principal adverse impacts. I think they're good. It's just that if you put them into the advisory and then ask the client whether they prefer wastewater or CO2 emissions, I mean, where do we get? I mean, that would be just too much.
I can also comment from the FNG side, we haven't been able to really explore the current implementation requirements, if all the detailed questions have to be asked to the client themselves, or are just to be used to categorize the products that are offered. But I would like to pick up the expression of impact to address it to Timo. And you recently just mentioned that you expect that the category of impact investments will probably or might disappear, and you expect any product to express the impact. And where do you see now best practice examples in the area of liquid investments, how impact is disclosed?
Maybe I should elaborate a little bit on what you mentioned, how I come to this conclusion. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that more and more products pop up, and we now really need to ask the impact question. So how do they really contribute to change? And if you look at the current classification schemes or the market reports, let's phrase it that way, of FNG, of SSF, of Eurosif, you have this extra category impact investments. And I would argue, so if you, for instance, look at the recent discussions on how to achieve impact, for example, the engagement approach is one way how you can achieve impact with equity investments, right? So that's broadly discussed in the literature. But if you look at the market studies, you have engagement as a separate strategy, and then on top, somewhere else, impact investments pop up. So for me, I propose we need to rethink that, and instead maybe stick to these old classification of best in class and so on and so forth, and always ask the question, so what is the impact? How does such products contribute to change? And by doing that, well, the old classification of impact investments as a separate category becomes obsolete. That's my how I consider it. Yeah, and what are good examples for the equity market? I definitely would say it is with effective engagement strategies, where you as an investor or as an asset manager, you join forces, ideally with like-minded people, on specific issues like climate change, and then you talk to management, you raise your voice on the annual meetings and try to achieve a change in strategy with the rights that you have as a shareholder. I would say that's probably, for the equity part, the most prominent strategy we can apply for achieving impact.
And do you suggest any concrete KPIs that can then be used to report on these exercises?
I mean, we know how. Since we are talking about Switzerland, you know ethos, for example, and you know what kind of principles they have, what kind of indicators they use. I mean, I would say, well, you could, for instance, if you want to report on the effectiveness of your impact and strategy, you could say, look, these are our general principles that we think are important for our investment universe or a specific portfolio. And with these individual firms, we have addressed these out of all of them. And in these areas, we were successful. Here we could influence management in that and that way. So if you just make that transparent, I think that would be, you know, probably what you were referring to is what could be indicators.
Thank you.
I think here there's an important point to make, right? I mean, we have our beautiful classification of, you know, exclusions only, and then integration, best in class, and then impact. Now, SFDR is completely interfering with that whole concept, because their aim was actually to create sustainable investments which gear money into sustainable activities, right? Is that impact? Well, it's more company impact, right? It's not investor impact. It's maybe company impact, but maybe we should reframe it and say this is outcome-oriented or investments, or objective-oriented investments. And then suddenly, of course, they realize, well, this is maybe what sustainable investments are being redefined as in the European Union, but there are all those ESG products. So what do we do with them? And therefore, they created this Article 9 and Article 8 thing. And obviously, the Article 9 funds were very few to start with, you know, because that category actually didn't really exist. But my forecast would be that there will be a very strong rise in Article 9 products going forward. It's actually a new asset class which has been created. Shall we call it impact investing? I wouldn't. I would rather say this is, you know, outcome or objective aligned investment, but it's certainly a new category which is due to grow very strongly. We feel a lot of interest from fund advisors on these products.
And since we are talking about impact and sustainable investment strategy, so may I ask Victor for one last comment? So on the EU action plan, to which extent does this framework of the EU enable or support to achieve impact through the financial markets?
Well, that's again a very, very good question. I'm getting all the tricky questions today. No, I think, you know, we're starting to see research identifying what you know, how we as manager, as investors, can generate impact. I think it's for me fair to say that doesn't seem at this stage yet to be the main focus of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. I think, you know, it dates back from a few years, and at that time the focus was on transparency, on getting more transparency around ESG. You know, we know that some impact can be created by engagement with investee companies. Some impact could be created by deciding to allocate capital to certain different asset classes, different investment projects. So there are channels by which you could create impact, but they don't, at this stage, fully seem to be, you know, taken on board in the sustainable finance agenda, which is obviously something we hope will change in the future. But that's why EuroCIF has a lot of work ahead of itself.
Okay, and as we need to come to a conclusion, I just would like to ask you one aspect that you would recommend Switzerland to pick up in the context of sustainable investing. Just very briefly from each of you. How can Switzerland learn from the experiences that were made? Who wants to start? Okay, Victor.
I'll start. No, I think the only thing I would say, you know, we discussed today how you know, how the EU rules may not be entirely perfect, and how potentially Switzerland can think about improving them and making them perfect for the domestic market. I would say the fact that they're not perfect in the EU is because they're very complex and difficult discussions, and I wouldn't say don't necessarily think that if you do it on your own, suddenly those difficult discussions are going to disappear. And I think it's something I can tell you that the United Kingdom is also starting to witness, whereby they're developing their taxonomy, and they're starting to realize that developing a taxonomy has some complexities attached to it. So that's my only advice I would say. There will always be complexity.
Well, Inge, I think I wouldn't give any advice, because given that I am based in Switzerland, and what I see is that we have a clear strategy actually, and the clear strategy is to become the leading financial marketplace in Europe, and maybe even the world in sustainable finance. And the way we want to achieve that is to let the different associations put forward their plans. We heard it from Frédéric. On the one hand side, we have the Swiss Bankers Association, we have the asset management associations, the different also the different associations of banks have issued their reports. We'll have the Building Bridges Summit in Geneva this fall, again to showcase also building bridges right between the international Geneva and the financial sector in Switzerland, to put forward this claim of sustainability leadership. So I think the way it works here in Switzerland is good and perfect, and we are taking into account all the developments internationally, but of course not gold plating them on top.
Yeah, maybe a short recommendation from my side. I think in light of the international developments and the market developments also within Switzerland, I think some sort of standard for private investors would be useful to increase transparency, how reliable, how trustworthy are individual products. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Herr Pitti.
Genau, dann würde ich mich also quasi auch dem Votum von Jan eigentlich anschließen. So quasi, ich möchte das natürlich als Basis von der Schweiz nicht selber Empfehlungen machen, aber ich bin davon überzeugt, dass die heutige Strategie, wie wir sie fahren, auch mit Blick auf die Entwicklungen, die bereits unsere Mitgliedsgesellschaften, aber auch der ganze Finanzdienstleistungssektor hier mitzieht, dass wir diese Strategie so fortfahren sollen und auch können. Und ich bin überzeugt davon, dass wir dann unsere Strategie als wichtiger oder als Leading Finanzplatz der Welt hier, also in diesem Bereich der Nachhaltigkeit, uns implementieren können.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich kann nur anmerken, dass natürlich andere Finanzplätze ähnliche Ambitionen haben. Von daher finde ich diesen Aspekt Sustainable Leadership definitiv wichtig, dass es hier auch ein Qualitätsrennen gibt zwischen den verschiedenen Plätzen, die entsprechend auch zum Beispiel, und den Aspekt nehme ich gerne von Timo auf, auch Standards setzen als Orientierung. Ja, damit möchte ich die Diskussion auch beenden. Herzlichen Dank an die Panelisten. Nachhaltigkeit ist komplex. Die Frage einfach, die wir heute klären wollten, definitiv nicht so, dass wir jetzt hier eine eindeutige Antwort haben. Ich danke Ihnen für die unterschiedlichen Perspektiven, die wir auf das Thema gewinnen konnten und damit dann letztendlich auch eben sehr neugierig sind, wie dann eine genaue Implementierung auch stattfindet. Von mir aus einen schönen Nachmittag. Und ich hoffe auch auf Seiten vom FNG, dass wir die geplante Live-Veranstaltung zum 20-jährigen Jubiläum auch dieses Jahr noch in der Schweiz nachholen können. Bis bald.
Vielen Dank. Tschüss.
Danke.
Besten Dank. Tschüss.
Merci.